Yeah, thank you very much. There's so much disagreement, even though there's also a lot of agreement, and probably it's surprising where the agreement is and where the disagreement. Let me start at some point. Let me start somewhere else. I think what you have said is that like a different way of making a point is that there are all sorts of sources for skeptical hypotheses, and I perfectly agree that some interpretations of what commitments to naturalism amount to turns naturalism into a source of skeptical hypotheses. So I would think of naturalism as you presented. Let me call this a set of views that you might want to call naturalism, as a set of skeptical hypotheses. So about all of this, I agree. I think there are anti-skeptical maneuvers, which is why I wouldn't go down that road. I wouldn't turn into the naturalistic skeptic, but I do think there's good pressure in that direction. So I do not try to run a conceptual argument against this. I think I have them, but that might, but that's not even very interesting. So I want to start somewhere else, because you made this claim that somehow Homer is an important contribution, which I also agree to, but I think that quite different sources, and some of them have been seen by some relevant people that you didn't mention in this context. I think two sources seem to be, or three actually, more Egypt, that's the Jan Assmann line. So there's henotheism, of course, in Echnaton, much earlier than Xenophanes, and that is still manifest in Plato's metaphor of the sun. The allegory of the sun is arguably, it derives from Echnaton. So henotheism. Then this sort of henotheism inspires, of course, Jewish monotheism. And Max Weber has made the point that the naturalistic skeptical hypotheses that you presented originate precisely in the prophets, in that tradition. That's Max Weber in Wirtschaft und Gesellschaft, which most philosophers do not know. This is where he introduces the disenchantment of the world, and by disenchantment of the world he means what they did. And Zauberung means giving up on the idea that human beings have magical powers. So nature turns into a domain that you cannot control by magical powers. So this leads to a transformation of religious style or literally skepticism style hypothesis into a naturalistic style skeptical hypothesis. So I think there are independent lines that go into this picture, and some of them are earlier. And India, for instance, like Hinduism is full of the idea that the gods mislead us until today. And we're talking, almost 1 billion believers. So I think that, when it comes so there are also in the contemporary world, there's significant, significant sources. Another source that one could mention would be what I call filmic skepticism. Inception, Matrix, etc., etc. So but then, so there are all sorts of different sources of skeptical hypotheses, I think. And one line, how they got into our world picture, to speak this way, is the line, that you presented. But I think there are all these other lines too. And some of those lines intersect with the Greeks. Arguably, India has influenced, at least Agrippa. Pyrrho is reported to have been to India, so there's an India story. There's an additional Egypt story. So I'm not sure whether we could tell the story in such a way that there's this really independent Greek story. So I think one would have to make a bigger case for the Greek story, in particular because Max Weber associates his understanding of ideology with that other story of the disenchantment of the world, Egypt, ancient Testament, which seems to be also an interesting line to consider. So this is, a lot of material that I'm now throwing in, historical material, but I think it's, it's part of the mix. So I wouldn't go into the, the Greeks did it story.
Thanks very much. That's a very, very rich and interesting question. I should say first of all that the title of the talk was Homer's Contribution, and of course that wasn't meant to exclude other people making contributions. So I was looking at his part in the story, and certainly there are a lot of things that go on in ancient Greek skepticism already, which don't lend themselves to a Homeric account like this in any obvious way. For example, where do you get Parmenidean paradox skepticism in Homer? There are contradictions in Homer, but that's actually precisely because he's not uncomfortable about contradictions the way that Parmenides is, and doesn't feel them as a paradox. But in general, you know, I don't mean to say it all comes from Homer alone. I mean, no, he's one very important source of this skeptical tradition, and then there are all sorts of other things happen. Regarding the two specific things you mentioned, the Hinduism case, yes, I just say yes. I mean, that's whether it actually influenced the Homeric tradition, you know, stands behind it. In some sense, our Indo-European common heritage stands behind Homer's versions of this and so on. I mean, that's
it stands behind Schopenhauer's Darwinian style. You know, like
right.
This leads to the Darwinian skepticism that you're presenting.
Right.
So Schopenhauer, of course, thinks, at least, and also historically it's true that due to the introduction of some of the Indian literature into the Western context, this has been associated via Schopenhauer and Nietzsche and then certain Darwinian influences in the second half of the 19th century, in particular in Germany. Mm-hmm. This has, I think, like some of the earliest forms of Churchland stuff. You know, you can really find arguments of this form, and the 19th century in German culture, second half, is full of these arguments. And I think that arguably, a lot of this, the Helmholtz quotes Schopenhauer. Everybody quotes Schopenhauer on that. So there might be.
Yeah, I mean that's really, I guess, just a different question from what I was addressing, which was about, you know, Greek forms of skepticism, where they come from. And very interesting questions, no doubt, but different questions. But on the Egypt case and henotheism and the prophets and so on, that's a very interesting point. And you mentioned Weber as somebody who had this thought that naturalism is prepared for by Judaism already. And actually, Hegel, I think, is you know, an earlier and equally interesting example of that view. You know, in the early theological writings, his position isn't the one that Charles Taylor usually attributes to him, which sees the scientific revolution in the 17th century as the key break, the key move to disenchantment of the natural world. Hegel really does that in the early theological writings in relation to Judaism, because Judaism has only one God, so it extracts, you know, the earth is no longer a God, the Skamandros would no longer be a God, and so on and so forth, and the natural world is no longer a God, and that's the key break towards disenchantment, and then there are various developments after that, but that's the key. So Hegel also held that view. Where does that leave us? I mean, I wasn't really doing any kind of genealogy of naturalism here at all. I mean, the literary skepticism I was concerned with isn't itself at all naturalistic. Right? It's just that I was saying, you know, if you want to see that something analogous to this type of skepticism can still be viable, then one good thing to do would be to wheel on a naturalistic set of arguments against a lot of our everyday beliefs. So again, the relationship's a bit tangential. Interesting question, but a bit tangential to what I was saying.
Thanks.
I have two thoughts that were suggested by what you said, and I just would like to argue. I would just like to ask you whether you think I'm right in having these thoughts. I mean, the first pertains to the observation that an evolutionary account of the validity of our thought could only extend to their, as you called it, extensional correctness. This seems to me to entail something that I anyway believe, but another seems to me to suggest an argument to the effect that there's the impossibility in principle of providing evolutionary comprehension of the capacity of thought. Therefore, I mean, if the factors through which one is capable of explaining evolutionarily the psychic powers of a living being fall short of distinguishing something through which essentially thoughts distinguish themselves from each other, then this is a psychic power that falls outside the purview of that form of explanation.
Right.
So, I mean, can I ask the second observation?
Please.
The second thought was, I just observe a distinction in kind between philosophical skepticism and literary skepticism, of which I'm not sure whether it does not make it slightly misleading to call both skepticism. I thought of philosophical skepticism as being as grounded in a course of reflection through which we are shattered in our confidence that we're able to vindicate our claims to truth and knowledge, that we, before we engaged in this line of thought, were quite happy to feel we were. Literary skepticism, by contrast, as you described it, is as well a literary representation of illusions and errors induced by superhuman powers, but it's the description or representation of illusions and errors, massive illusion errors, to the detriment of those who hold them. Now, this description, however, seems to me to manifest, not to thematize, but to manifest superior confidence in the describer's capacity to have knowledge of the relevant topics. So your description of possible errors, for example, if they were made in your own voice, would, if so made, express quite unshattered confidence in the power to discern the truth with respect to the questions, to the things in question. So that seems to me to be an important distinction.
Right. I'll begin with the latter one because I think that's probably the easier question to address. This is part of the reason, aside from the sort of intrinsic merits of the case, why I insisted that the optimistic evolutionary story is part of the story. Right. I mean, there would be a kind of pragmatic self-contradiction, which I take it the direction your question was heading in. If I were to say there's an evolutionary explanation for massive error, but no such explanation, or indeed a preclusion, an evolutionary preclusion of truth, because, what are you giving us then, But no, the part of the story is precisely that the evolutionary account, the optimistic evolutionary account, does capture a very important part of it. It explains our capacity to indeed arrive at truths. And, I take it that if the challenge is not that one, but it's something like, what makes you think that all these falsehoods are falsehoods rather than the people who claim the opposite, or that the evolutionary story is the right one rather than the opposite, and so on. I take it there's no global or, soundbite answer to that. I mean, you just have to look at each of the issues and see what the evidence is. And on any one of these issues, it's an enormously complicated story. I mean, take the God case, for example. I mean, to adjudicate the God, the God problem, you'd have to talk about the development of modern physics, modern biology, with Darwin. You'd have to talk about the development of biblical scholarship, the development of the study of mythologies, of other cultures and so on since the 18th century and so on. I mean, it would be an enormous story to show why there is massive reason to cast overboard the belief in God or gods. And I take it each of these stories would be similar. But I also take it that if you take on that burden in each of these cases, it looks pretty much as I was sketching it.
So I was not questioning the truth of any of those claims, just observing that the literary skeptic is one that is possessed of unshattered confidence in his or her own power to discern the truth with respect to the issues in question, while the philosophical skeptic is in a position in which his confidence in his power to be able to vindicate his claims or her claims to truth and knowledge is shattered.
Sure.
So I just
I see. That's
sort of mark a distinction between what in each case is called skepticism.
Oh yes, well, no, that's absolutely right. I mean, I take it that many of these forms of skepticism, both the ancient ones and modern ones, are incompatible with each other. I'm not saying they're all, skepticism in virtue of being mutually consistent. I mean, for example, paradox skepticism a la Parmenides ends up telling you, the way I read him, that you can only really say one thing, and that's, it is, esti. So, any kind of skepticism that is predicated on being able to do more than that is at odds with Parmenides' form of skepticism. So, no, I take it that's quite right. I mean, this is not skepticism in the spirit of, Pyrrhonian skepticism or something like that, which forgoes all beliefs. On the other question is very interesting. I found it even more interesting, actually. This question, whether, in a way, the point I was making about intentionality versus extensionality doesn't call into question the whole evolutionary story, because it leaves intentionality evolutionarily inexplicable. I mean, there's a kind of peritrope argument. You're kind of turning the tables on the naturalistic story there. I think that's a very, very interesting suggestion, and I'd have to think more about that. I mean, one thing I'm tempted to say is something like, well, let's distinguish, as I did, between enabling and causing, right? I mean, roughly, enabling is not a matter of not being causally relevant. It's a matter of not having a full causal story of why the phenomenon is there, merely a partial story, one that gives certain necessary conditions for the phenomenon to be there, roughly. So, I mean, if you invoke that kind of distinction, you might want to say, well, it can indeed be the case that evolution doesn't explain all the intentional nuance in the sense of giving a causal explanation, but it does. Evolution does arguably provide the enabling conditions for that, right? For intentional discriminations still. And then you might also want to say things like, well, more broadly, things happen in nature that are sometimes require a different kind of explanation than one in terms of simple adaptiveness. So, for example, why do we have appendices, right? They serve no useful function. They cause us all sorts of problems because they go wrong and so on. You can't explain that in terms of adaptiveness, but you have a different kind of a story in terms of, what happened way back when, and how evolution hasn't yet weeded that weakness out, and so on and so forth. And you might similarly have a kind of naturalistic but not non-straightforward explanation of intentional discriminations too. Perhaps it was that for example, the gene that enabled us to do all of the wonderful extensional discriminations we can do, that genetic modification brought this with it. It happened like that, It's just one of these things, and both got. Although it was the extensionality that selected that gene out, intentionality came along with it, and bully for us. I mean, it's good for us that it did, because we're able to do all sorts of things that we value, but evolution couldn't care less about because of it. I mean, that might be an answer.
I'd like to understand better the interesting claim that you made at the first half of your talk that because they had an epistemology, they invited, so to say, skepticism, and suggesting a little bit that if they hadn't had that epistemology, skepticism wouldn't have had a foothold, so to say. Right. But then what you... so I try to understand that claim. Because what you then described as their epistemology basically was that they had two conceptions of sources of knowledge, the senses and God. And I mean, it doesn't seem to be unreasonable to think that whenever, so the very idea of knowledge includes some conception or some being in a certain position to answer the question, how do you know? So having knowledge includes being in a position to answer that question, how do you know? And that requires some conception of the sources of your knowledge. And if that is, I mean, if you agree that, one would, or one could redescribe the claim you made, the very fact that they had knowledge or that they made knowledge claims at all invited skepticism. So, I mean, because, I mean, if we describe it in that way, one would say having knowledge or making knowledge claims already implies in a certain sense having an epistemology, I mean, in that minimal sense, as you describe it, as having a conception of the sources of your knowledge. And if that were true, so yeah, the very idea of that knowledge claims are made invited the skepticism. I mean, would that be a way of reading it, or the same?
I mean, I think it's a very interesting point, and clearly they did have knowledge vocabulary. They had a fairly diverse knowledge vocabulary, various verbs and nouns and so on that were in that ballpark. Yeah, I think epistemology is not the same thing as having an account of how people know or how you know generically, right? I mean, what you're describing would be consistent with, for example, my having endlessly various explanations in answer to the question, how do you know, on different occasions, right? Sometimes it's because of, I was there, and fortunately, sometimes it's I looked, sometimes it was I heard it, sometimes it was, it just came to my mind, sometimes it was, and so on and so forth. I mean, they could be as various in principle as the different claims we make. And it's that multiplicity that would pose, constitute the difference with what I'm describing, right? That's what makes an epistemology, is that it's more systematic, right? More economical in the explanatory principles appeal to than that. And that's also what makes it vulnerable to, or liable to turn into the skepticism, because instead of having to go round and take on this sort of almost endless job, or perhaps actually endless job, of attacking the particular knowledge claims and the particular grounds given, or the claims themselves and the particular grounds given for them, you just have a sort of two-stop shopping situation. If you can undermine confidence in divine inspiration and undermine confidence in the senses, the whole construction comes crashing down. Thanks. Brady.
Just to follow up on that for a second, kind of a thought that comes to mind is what we heard today about the piecemeal character Pyrrhonism in particular. Could you imagine somebody who's just got a kind of, for better or worse, a kind of, inveterate confidence deficit? And he goes around and he says, well, how do you know that? Well, my mother told it. Well, I've heard that before. Your mother was wrong about this other thing. Or, oh, it just came into your mind. But this stupid idea about, going swimming in the icy water, that's also something that came into your mind. Right? Somebody like this could be as piecemeal and variegated in his skeptical attacks as ever you please, but he would still be, engaging in a recognizably skeptical Pyrrhonist activity. So is it really the case that you have to have this short shopping list in order to have skepticism, in order to have something as organized as what we see, especially in Sextus, but also in the earlier sources, certainly you do. But skepticism as a kind of phenomenon that then becomes organized, that doesn't seem to presuppose that.
Yeah, a lot depends here on what you mean by presupposed. I was telling a historical story, and the question I was trying to answer was, how does skepticism, broad skepticism, become a cultural option, really? And then once it's become a cultural option, all sorts of variations on the theme can develop, and they may have very different characteristics from the first version that came along, and so on. So that was the question I was trying to ask. In fact, when I was making that point, I was thinking of Pyrrhonism. That Pyrrhonism really does sort of take on the job of taking claims one by one, or at least class by class. And over the many books of Sextus, trying to attack them one by one. And the thought was, well, that might become a sort of interesting and plausible exercise once the culture is already sort of open to skeptical thoughts. But if Thucydides, for example, had come along in Homer's period and been bolshy as he is with Agamemnon along the lines of taking each claim that everybody made and trying to produce an equally plausible counterargument, would that have really convinced anybody, or Thucydides himself? I mean, there's a sort of it's a little bit, well, I mean, it's really a little bit like all sorts of intellectual developments. Once you've had some Greek cosmologist have the thought that maybe the reality is constituted by water or whatnot, you can eventually have modern physics with its extremely complex theory about, electrons and quarks and and all the mathematics and so on. But if could somebody have come along with an extremely complicated story ab initio and got anywhere with it? And the thought is no. I mean, you do need that process if the question is a causal one.
Could I just lean against that just very briefly? Just think of, just a kind of idea as an alternative. Well, maybe there's a kind of comedic mood that overcomes a whole society. Authority somehow becomes questionable for maybe reasons of natural catastrophe. The rule of law is somehow shaken. There is corruption, all the kinds of things that happen, and there's just like a general mood of Leichtsinn und Langeweile, as Hegel says, right? And that one passage in the preface to the Phenomenology. People just have this kind of sense, it's blasé, it's a kind of comedic, satiric attitude, and that could become pervasive in a kind of skeptical way. It seems to me that could also happen without there being a kind of epistemology, and then a kind of skepticism growing out of that, just as a...
Yeah, I guess, in a way that would be supporting my case, right? I mean, it's saying that you need something to happen other than somebody coming up with a lot of individual arguments tailored to the myriad claims that you're calling into question, or to get to your global skepticism. I mean, my claim is this is what happened. This is how it actually happened, and the only advantage it has over your story is that it's historically true, whereas yours is a fiction. But that was the task, to explain how it happened.